Jack had always considered himself a simple man. He liked his coffee black, his steak medium rare, and his pool crystal clear. But life, as it turns out, has a way of dragging even the most unassuming individuals into absurdity. And absurdity, in Jack's case, came in the form of the Homeowners Association, or HOA, as they like to call themselves, presumably because harbingers of annoyance didn't fit on their letterhead. The trouble started on a sunny Tuesday morning when Jack was lounging by his backyard pool, sipping iced tea and contemplating whether he should finally fix the squeaky gate or just let it become part of the neighborhood's ambience. That's when he heard the unmistakable sound of a clipboard-wielding HOA officer marching up his driveway. Her name was Linda, short for lording it over everyone, Jack assumed, and she had the kind of smile that suggested she just found a new rule to enforce. "Good morning, Jack," Linda chirped, her tone dripping with faux friendliness. "Lovely day we're having, isn't it?" Jack squinted at her. "Depends. Are you here to ruin it?" Linda's smile tightened into something resembling a grimace. "I'm here on behalf of the HOA to address a matter of grave concern." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Grave concern? Did someone steal the community mailbox again?" Linda ignored him and pointed dramatically at his pool. "Water waste." Jack blinked. "Excuse me?" "Your pool," Linda said, as though explaining basic arithmetic to a toddler. "It's an egregious display of water waste during a drought." Jack stared at her for a moment, then glanced at his pool. A modest rectangle filled with exactly the amount of water required for it to be a pool and not, say, a hole in the ground. "Linda," he said slowly, "it's a pool. It's supposed to have water in it." Linda sighed as if she were explaining quantum physics to someone who still believed the Earth was flat. "The HOA has decided that all pools in the neighborhood must be drained immediately to conserve water." Jack laughed. A short, incredulous bark that startled Linda into clutching her clipboard tighter. "You're kidding." "I assure you I am not," Linda replied with all the solemnity of someone announcing a new tax law. Jack leaned back in his chair and sipped his iced tea thoughtfully. "So let me get this straight. You want me to drain my pool because it's wasting water?" Linda nodded. "And how do you propose I do that? With buckets? A straw?" Linda's smile returned, sharper now. "We've arranged for a professional service to come by tomorrow morning and handle it for you." Jack set down his glass and stared at her like she'd just suggested replacing oxygen with carbon monoxide for environmental reasons. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Linda replied, clearly enjoying herself now. Jack considered arguing, he really did, but then he remembered that arguing with Linda was like trying to reason with a raccoon over ownership rights to your trash bin. So instead, he smiled. A slow, dangerous smile that made Linda falter just slightly. "Fine," he said. "Drain my pool." Linda blinked. "Really?" "Absolutely," Jack said cheerfully. "I wouldn't dream of defying the HOA." Linda narrowed her eyes suspiciously but nodded anyway. "Good. I'll see you tomorrow." As she marched back down the driveway, clipboard clutched like a weapon of mass irritation. Jack leaned back in his chair and stared at his pool thoughtfully. If Linda wanted war over water waste, then war she would get. The next morning arrived with all the pomp and circumstance of an impending disaster. Or at least that's how Jack saw it as he watched the professional service team set up their equipment in his backyard under Linda's watchful eye. She stood there like a general overseeing troops before battle, clipboard in hand and smugness radiating off her like solar flares. "It's for the greater good," Linda informed him as the team began siphoning water from his pool into a massive truck parked on the street. Jack nodded solemnly. "Of course it is." By noon, his pool was an empty concrete pit that looked more like an abandoned skate park than anything resembling luxury or leisure. Linda seemed pleased, too pleased, and Jack knew then that he couldn't let this stand. That evening, as he sat on his porch staring at what used to be his oasis of tranquility, inspiration struck like lightning, or perhaps more accurately like petty revenge wrapped in bureaucratic irony. You see, what Linda didn't know, what no one in the HOA knew, was that Jack wasn't just some guy with a pool and too much free time. He was also the legal owner of the neighborhood's water rights, a fact he'd stumbled upon years ago when purchasing his property but had never thought much about until now. And so began Jack's plan. not just to refill his pool, but to remind Linda and her clipboard-wielding cronies exactly who held the cards in this ridiculous game they'd started. The next morning, Jack called up every resident in the neighborhood who'd ever complained about HOA policies, which turned out to be most of them, and explained his plan. He would temporarily cut off water access to all HOA board members' homes until they agreed to rescind their absurd pool draining policy. The backlash was immediate and glorious. By noon, Linda was back on Jack's driveway looking less like an overzealous bureaucrat and more like someone who just discovered their car had been stolen by squirrels. "You can't do this," she sputtered. Jack leaned against his porch railing and grinned. "Actually, I can." Linda waved her clipboard frantically as though it held some magical power capable of reversing reality itself. "This is illegal," Jack shrugged casually. "Not according to my deed." Linda opened her mouth to argue but closed it again when Jack handed her a copy of said deed, highlighted for maximum impact, and watched as her face turned various shades of pale. This isn't over," she muttered before storming off down the driveway. Jack chuckled and sipped his iced tea triumphantly as he watched her go. It wasn't just about refilling his pool anymore. It was about sending a message. Don't mess with Jack or his water rights. By evening, HOA board members were practically begging him to restore their water access, and Jack obliged, but only after they signed an agreement promising never to enforce another absurd rule without consulting residents first. As for Linda, well, let's just say she learned an important lesson about picking battles wisely and avoiding neighbors who happen to own your neighborhood's lifeblood. And so Jack refilled his pool, not just with water but with sweet, sweet satisfaction, and lounged by its edge once more knowing that sometimes revenge isn't just petty. It's poetic justice served ice cold, like iced tea on a sunny Tuesday morning. Jack's pool was finally full again, shimmering under the California sun like a beacon of defiance. But if you thought this was the end of his saga with the HOA, you clearly underestimated their capacity for pettiness. The draining of Jack's pool had been merely the opening salvo. What followed was a campaign of bureaucratic warfare so absurd, it could have been mistaken for satire if it weren't painfully real. It started innocently enough, or at least as innocently as anything involving Linda and her clipboard could be. Jack received yet another letter from the HOA, this one outlining new water conservation measures for the neighborhood. The tone of the letter was sanctimonious enough to make a preacher blush, and Jack couldn't help but laugh as he read it aloud to his dog, Max. Effective immediately, Jack began, adopting his best imitation of Linda's officious voice. All residents are prohibited from using sprinklers, hoses, or any other water dispensing devices for outdoor purposes. Lawns must be replaced with drought-resistant landscaping within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in fines. Max tilted his head in confusion, which Jack took as confirmation that even dogs found this ridiculous. Jack wasn't opposed to water conservation. In fact, as a hydrologist, he understood the importance of it better than most. But what irked him wasn't the policy itself. It was the hypocrisy. A quick stroll through the neighborhood revealed that several HOA board members, including Linda, were still maintaining lush green lawns that looked like they belonged on a golf course rather than in drought-stricken California. Jack decided to investigate further. Armed with a pair of binoculars and an unhealthy amount of caffeine, he spent the next few nights observing his neighbors' watering habits. What he discovered was both infuriating and hilarious. Linda had installed an elaborate underground irrigation system to keep her lawn pristine, while everyone else's yards slowly turned into dust bowls. Another board member, Greg, had taken to watering his garden under cover of darkness, presumably hoping no one would notice the suspiciously moist soil come morning. Jack knew he couldn't let this slide. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, then so would he. The next day, Jack attended the monthly HOA meeting, an event he usually avoided like expired milk, but now approached with the enthusiasm of someone about to drop a bombshell. The meeting was held in the community center, a beige building that smelled faintly of mildew and regret. Linda presided over the gathering like a queen addressing her subjects, clipboard in hand and smugness firmly intact. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice dripping with condescension. "As you know, We've implemented new water conservation measures to ensure our neighborhood does its part during this drought. Jack raised his hand before she could continue. Yes, Jack, Linda said, her smile tight enough to snap. I just wanted to say how much I admire your commitment to water conservation, Jack said sweetly. It must be difficult maintaining such high standards while also keeping your lawn looking like something out of Better Homes and Gardens. The room went silent except for a few poorly stifled snickers from other residents. Linda's smile faltered. I don't know what you're implying. Oh, I'm not implying anything, Jack replied innocently. I'm simply pointing out that your lawn seems remarkably hydrated. Linda opened her mouth to respond but closed it again when Jack pulled out his phone and began scrolling through photos. Photos he'd taken of her underground irrigation system in action. Care to explain these? Jack asked, holding up his phone for everyone to see. Linda's face turned a shade of red that could only be described as alarming. This is an invasion of privacy, she sputtered. Is it? Jack countered. Or is it simply holding you accountable to the same standards you expect from everyone else? The room erupted into murmurs as residents began whispering among themselves. Jack could see several people nodding in agreement. Apparently, he wasn't the only one tired of Linda's antics. Greg tried to come to her defense but quickly found himself in hot water when Jack revealed photographic evidence of his midnight watering sessions. By the time Jack finished presenting his case, which included detailed charts comparing water usage across different properties, the HOA board looked less like an authority figure and more like a group of kids caught cheating on a math test. Linda attempted damage control by suggesting that perhaps exceptions should be made for essential greenery. But Jack wasn't having it. Essential greenery? He repeated incredulously. Linda, this is California, not Versailles. The meeting ended with several residents demanding an audit of HOA policies and practices. A suggestion Linda reluctantly agreed to after realizing she no longer had the support needed to shut it down. Jack left feeling victorious but also slightly disappointed. He'd been hoping for more fireworks. Of course, Linda wasn't done yet. Over the next few weeks, she doubled down on enforcing HOA rules against anyone who dared challenge her authority, including Jack. She sent him multiple warnings about minor infractions. A gate that squeaked too loudly? Seriously? Patio furniture that wasn't aesthetically consistent with neighborhood standards, whatever that meant. And even Max barking during daylight hours. Apparently dogs were only allowed to bark at night. Jack responded by complying with each rule in increasingly absurd ways. He oiled his gate so thoroughly it swung open if someone so much as sneezed near it. He painted his patio furniture neon pink just to see if Linda would dare call it inconsistent. And he trained Max to bark exclusively at 3 a.m., a move that earned him complaints from neighbors but also their grudging respect. Through it all, Jack maintained his sense of humor. And his pool remained full despite Linda's best efforts to find some loophole that would force him to drain it again. By now, most residents had grown tired of Linda's reign and began rallying behind Jack as their unofficial leader in resisting HOA tyranny. Some even started hosting secret meetings at his house where they brainstormed ways to push back against absurd policies. A development that thrilled Max since it meant more people around willing to give him belly rubs. Jack knew he couldn't keep this up forever. At some point there would need to be real change within the HOA, but for now, he was content enjoying small victories while sipping iced tea by his pool and watching Linda struggle under the weight of her own hypocrisy. Because if there's one thing Jack had learned through all this madness, it's that revenge isn't just sweet. Sometimes it's downright refreshing, like a perfectly chilled drink on a hot summer day. Jack had always considered himself a patient man. He could wait in line at the DMV without breaking a sweat, endure endless hold music on customer service calls, and even sit through one of Linda's HOA meetings without flipping a table. But everyone has their limits, and Jack's patience was officially running on fumes. The HOA wasn't just enforcing absurd rules anymore. They were escalating their vendetta against him in ways that bordered on comical. It started with the fines. Oh, the fines. Jack began receiving notices for violations so petty. He wondered if Linda had hired a team of squirrels to spy on him. There was a $50 fine for improperly trimmed hedges. His hedges were literally 2 inches taller than the HOA's arbitrary limit. A $75 fine for unauthorized outdoor lighting. he'd strung up fairy lights for a barbecue, and a $100 fine for excessive noise pollution. Max had barked twice. During the afternoon, Jack paid the first few fines out of sheer bemusement, but when the HOA sent him a $200 penalty for failure to maintain uniform mailbox aesthetics, he decided enough was enough. Uniform mailbox aesthetics? Jack muttered to himself as he stared at the notice. What does that even mean? Should I paint it beige and glue a bow tie on it? Max wagged his tail in agreement, which Jack took as confirmation that his dog shared his disdain for bureaucratic nonsense. But Jack wasn't just annoyed, he was inspired. If Linda wanted to play dirty, then Jack would play dirtier. He spent the next few days combing through his property's legal documents, searching for anything that might give him leverage against the HOA. And that's when he found it. A dusty old contract buried in the depths of his filing cabinet, signed by the original developer of the neighborhood decades ago. The contract was simple but powerful. It granted exclusive water rights to whoever owned Jack's property. In other words, Jack wasn't just a homeowner. He was the unofficial king of water distribution for the entire neighborhood. Jack stared at the document for a long moment, then grinned so wide it startled Max into barking. This wasn't just leverage, it was a golden ticket to revenge. The next morning, Jack strolled into Linda's office with all the confidence of a man who knew he held all the cards. Linda looked up from her desk, her expression souring as soon as she saw him. "Jack," she said curtly, "what can I do for you?" "Oh, nothing much," Jack replied casually, pulling out the contract and placing it on her desk with a flourish. "Just thought you'd like to see this." Linda frowned and began reading. As her eyes scanned the page, her face went through several stages of disbelief. Confusion, horror, and finally rage. This can't be real," she sputtered. "Oh, it's real," Jack said cheerfully. "Signed and notarized back in 1983. Linda stared at him like he'd just told her Santa Claus was suing her for defamation. "You're telling me you control the neighborhood's water rights?" "Yep," Jack said, popping the P for emphasis. Linda tried to argue. She really did. But Jack had come prepared with copies of every relevant document and even an affidavit from his lawyer confirming the validity of his claim. By the time he finished explaining, Linda looked like she wanted to crawl under her desk and disappear. "This doesn't change anything," she said weakly. "Oh, it changes everything," Jack replied with a grin. "Because starting tomorrow, I'm implementing new water usage policies for the neighborhood." Linda blinked. "You can't do that." "Sure I can," Jack said brightly. "I own the rights." And so began what residents would later refer to as the Great Water War. Jack didn't actually cut off anyone's water. He wasn't that cruel. But he did impose restrictions on HOA board members' usage until they agreed to rescind their ridiculous policies. Greg was the first to crack after his sprinklers mysteriously stopped working one morning. He showed up at Jack's house looking sheepish and holding an apology letter written in barely legible handwriting. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," Greg mumbled as Max sniffed his shoes suspiciously. "Apology accepted," Jack said magnanimously. "Now go tell Linda she's next." Linda held out longer than expected, probably because she was too stubborn to admit defeat, but even she couldn't withstand the pressure forever. When her underground irrigation system mysteriously shut down, Jack refused to confirm or deny involvement. She finally called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss repealing their water conservation policies. The meeting was glorious chaos. Residents showed up in droves, many of them armed with complaints about years of unfair treatment by the HOA. One elderly woman stood up and accused Linda of fining her $50 for having pink flamingos in her yard, a claim Linda denied but couldn't prove false because flamingos weren't technically against HOA rules. By the end of the night, Linda looked like someone who'd aged 10 years in 2 hours. She reluctantly agreed to repeal all recent water-related fines and promised to review other policies with input from residents, a concession that felt like victory wrapped in bureaucracy. Jack left feeling triumphant but also oddly reflective. He hadn't set out to become some kind of neighborhood hero. He just wanted his pool back and maybe some peace and quiet. But somewhere along the way, he'd stumbled into something bigger, a chance to stand up against petty tyranny and remind people that sometimes rules are meant to be challenged. Back at home, Jack poured himself a glass of iced tea and sat by his pool with Max sprawled at his feet. The water shimmered under the moonlight, calm and undisturbed, a stark contrast to everything that had happened over the past few weeks. Jack raised his glass in salute, not just to victory but to resilience, humor, and maybe even a little bit of revenge. Because if there's one thing Jack had learned through all this madness, it's that sometimes fighting back isn't just necessary. It's downright satisfying, like taking your first sip of iced tea after draining your enemy's metaphorical pool dry. Jack woke up the morning after the HOA meeting feeling like a man who had just conquered a small kingdom. His pool gleamed in the sunlight. His dog Max was wagging his tail with the enthusiasm of someone who knew his owner was victorious. And the neighborhood was buzzing with whispers of his triumph. Jack had done it. He'd forced the HOA to bend, if not break, under the sheer weight of their own absurdity. But as satisfying as this victory was, Jack knew he wasn't quite finished yet. You see, Jack wasn't just interested in repealing a few ridiculous rules. No, Jack wanted to make sure the HOA learned a lesson they'd never forget. A lesson about fairness, transparency, and most importantly, not messing with a man who controls your water supply. Linda, however, seemed determined to pretend that nothing had changed. She still marched around the neighborhood with her clipboard like a general surveying her troops, issuing passive-aggressive smiles and muttering about restoring order. Jack found this both amusing and deeply irritating. The woman had lost, but she refused to admit it, and that made her dangerous. So Jack decided it was time for phase 2 of his plan, reforming the HOA from the inside out. Now, Jack wasn't exactly what you'd call a joiner. The idea of voluntarily attending HOA meetings made him want to lie down and take a nap. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and Jack realized that if he really wanted to change things, he'd have to infiltrate the system. He'd have to become one of them, or at least pretend to. The next HOA election was only a few weeks away, and Jack wasted no time launching his campaign. His slogan, "What are you waiting for? Vote Jack." It was cheesy, sure, but it got people's attention. And more importantly, it made Linda's eye twitch every time she saw one of his flyers. Jack didn't bother with traditional campaign strategies like speeches or debates. Instead, he leaned into what he knew best, humor and pettiness. He hosted pool parties for potential voters, complete with free snacks and drinks, handed out custom water bottles with his face on them, "Stay hydrated with Jack," and even created a parody video mocking Linda's clipboard obsession. By the time Election Day rolled around, Jack was practically a local celebrity. The results were announced at yet another painfully beige HOA meeting. Linda sat at the front of the room looking like she'd swallowed a lemon as the votes were tallied. When Jack's name was declared as the new president of the HOA, he couldn't help but grin. Partly because he'd won, but mostly because Linda looked like she might actually combust from sheer rage. "Congratulations," Linda said through gritted teeth as she handed him the ceremonial clipboard. A cheap plastic thing that felt more like an insult than an honor. "Thank you," Jack replied cheerfully. "I promise to use this power wisely." Linda muttered something under her breath that sounded suspiciously like, "You'll regret this." But Jack ignored her. He had bigger fish to fry, or in this case, bigger pools to fill. As president of the HOA, Jack wasted no time implementing changes. First on his agenda, abolishing all fines for minor infractions. No more penalties for squeaky gates or mismatched patio furniture. Residents were free to live their lives without fear of Linda's wrath. Next came transparency. Jack insisted on publishing detailed financial reports so everyone could see exactly how their HOA fees were being spent. Unsurprisingly, this revealed some questionable expenditures, like the $500 Linda had spent on clipboard maintenance last year. Jack also introduced new policies designed to make life easier for residents. Need extra time to replace your lawn with drought-resistant plants? No problem, just let him know and he'd grant an extension. Want to host a barbecue without worrying about noise complaints? Go ahead, Jack even offered to bring burgers. The neighborhood quickly transformed under Jack's leadership. People started smiling more, chatting with their neighbors instead of glaring at them over fence lines. Even Max seemed happier. He barked less now that there weren't any HOA officers skulking around trying to catch him in the act. But not everyone was thrilled about these changes, namely Linda and her loyal band of clipboard enthusiasts. They tried everything they could think of to undermine Jack's authority. Spreading rumors about him, apparently he was too lenient on flamingo owners, filing complaints about his pool parties, which were technically within HOA guidelines, and even attempting to stage a coup during one particularly heated meeting. Jack handled all of this with his usual blend of humor and sarcasm. When Linda accused him of destroying tradition, he replied by hosting an event called Tradition Destruction Day, complete with piñatas shaped like clipboards and free flamingo lawn ornaments for everyone who attended. By the end of his first year as HOA president, Jack had accomplished what many thought impossible. He turned a once oppressive organization into something resembling functional democracy, and he'd done it all without draining his pool once. Linda eventually resigned from her position on the board, not officially citing Jack as her reason for leaving, but making it clear through several passive-aggressive comments that she blamed him entirely. Jack sent her a thank you card anyway, "Thanks for inspiring me," and even offered her one of his custom water bottles as a parting gift. She declined. As for Jack, he continued serving as HOA president for another term before stepping down to focus on his real passion, hydrology, and hosting increasingly elaborate pool parties for his grateful neighbors. Because if there's one thing Jack had learned through all this madness, it's that sometimes revenge isn't just sweet, it's downright refreshing, like diving into your perfectly filled pool after draining your enemy's metaphorical power dry. Jack's reign as HOA president had come to an end, but his legacy lived on. The neighborhood was thriving in ways no one could have imagined during Linda's clipboard dictatorship. Lawns were a mix of drought-resistant plants and unapologetically pink flamingos. Gates squeaked freely without fear of fines, and the community had embraced the concept of live and let live. Jack had done what he set out to do. He turned the HOA into something people didn't actively hate. And yet, Jack wasn't quite ready to fade into obscurity. You see, Jack had one final act of revenge up his sleeve, not against Linda specifically, though she was still at the top of his mental most annoying people list, but against the entire idea of HOA tyranny. Jack wanted to immortalize his story, not just for his neighbors, but for anyone who'd ever been fined for having the wrong shade of mulch or dared to plant daisies instead of HOA-approved hydrangeas. So Jack did what any self-respecting man with a flair for drama would do. He started a YouTube channel. The channel was called Poolside Justice, and its tagline was simple: taking on HOAs one clipboard at a time. Jack filmed his first video sitting by his pool, wearing sunglasses and sipping iced tea like a man who'd just won the lottery. Max sat beside him, wagging his tail and occasionally barking for dramatic effect. "Welcome to Poolside Justice," Jack began, leaning back in his chair with the air of someone who had absolutely no regrets. "I'm Jack, your friendly neighborhood HOA reformer. If you've ever been harassed by someone wielding a clipboard and an inflated sense of power, you're in the right place." Jack spent the next 10 minutes recounting his saga with Linda and the HOA, from the draining of his pool to his eventual takeover as president. He didn't hold back on the humor, peppering his story with sarcastic commentary and exaggerated reenactments, complete with Max playing the role of Linda. By the time he finished, he was laughing so hard he nearly spilled his iced tea. The video went viral within days. Apparently, Jack wasn't alone in his disdain for HOAs. Thousands of people flooded the comments section with their own horror stories about being fined for everything from mismatched doorknobs to overly enthusiastic Christmas decorations. Some even asked Jack for advice on how to deal with their own neighborhood tyrants. Jack responded to every comment with a mix of humor and genuine advice. He encouraged people to read their property deeds carefully. You never know when you might stumble upon exclusive water rights. Attend HOA meetings to hold board members accountable, and, most importantly, never underestimate the power of petty revenge. As his channel grew, Jack started branching out into other content. He filmed tutorials on how to throw epic pool parties. Step 1. Invite everyone except Linda. Reviews of ridiculous HOA rules from across the country. Did you know there's an HOA that bans garage doors? I'm not kidding. And even a series called Clipboard Confessions, where he interviewed former HOA board members who'd seen the error of their ways. Jack's favorite video, however, was one he titled The Flamingo Revolution. In it, he encouraged viewers to place pink flamingos in their yards as a symbol of resistance against oppressive HOAs. The video sparked a movement. Soon, neighborhoods across America were dotted with flamingos, each one standing proudly as a beacon of defiance. Linda, predictably, hated every second of it. She sent Jack multiple cease and desist letters demanding he stop using her name in his videos, but Jack ignored them. He wasn't technically breaking any laws. He'd always referred to her as Clipboard Queen, rather than using her real name. And besides, he knew she didn't have the resources to take him to court. Jack did send her a peace offering once. A custom clipboard engraved with the words, "Retired Tyrant." She never responded. By now, Jack's channel had amassed millions of subscribers. He'd become something of a folk hero among disgruntled homeowners everywhere. A symbol of hope for anyone who'd ever been told their mailbox wasn't up to code or their fence was half an inch too tall. People started sending him fan mail and flamingos, thanking him for inspiring them to stand up against their own HOAs. Jack loved every minute of it. Not just because he enjoyed being famous, though he did, but because he genuinely believed in what he was doing. He wasn't just telling funny stories. He was empowering people to take back control over their homes and their lives. One day, while filming yet another poolside video about absurd HOA rules, this one involved a neighborhood that banned wind chimes, Jack paused mid-sentence and looked directly at the camera. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I never set out to become an internet sensation or start a revolution. I just wanted my pool back." He smiled and raised his glass in salute. "But sometimes life has other plans." Max barked in agreement. "Anyway," Jack continued, leaning forward conspiratorially, "if you've enjoyed this video or any of my videos, do me a favor. Like it, share it with your friends who hate clipboards as much as I do. Leave a comment telling me your own HOA horror story, and don't forget to subscribe." He grinned mischievously. "Because trust me, you don't want to miss what I've got planned next." With that, Jack leaned back in his chair and took another sip of iced tea as Max wagged his tail enthusiastically beside him. The camera panned out to show the shimmering pool behind them, a symbol not just of victory but of freedom, and then faded to black. And thus ended another chapter in Jack's ongoing saga, a story that proved once and for all that sometimes revenge isn't just sweet. It's downright refreshing, like diving into your perfectly filled pool after draining your enemy's metaphorical power dry.